G7 leaders meeting concluded recently, and the G7 leaders, of course, representing some of the most powerful countries in the world, talked about the major challenges facing the global order today, as well as humanity more generally. Now, three of the big issues that we're going to focus on today are China, Russia, and the Israel-Hamas war. What exactly did the big G7 nations say about these things? So first of all, China. China is a country that has had a very difficult relationship with a number of G7 countries. So what the G7 acknowledged was that China had a major role to play in a number of global issues like climate change, pollution, health security, economic stability. They also made clear that they want a China that is growing and is contributing to the international economic system. So they were trying to show that they actually want to cooperate. So the G7 leaders stressed that they still want to cooperate with China, that they don't wish ill on China, but they also made clear that they have serious concerns about China's trade practices, about its export controls, about the fact that China has been sponsoring cyber activities like cyber attacks. The G7 also emphasized the importance of keeping peace across the Taiwan states and also supported Taiwan's participation in international organizations. Also on maritime security, the G7 raised concerns about China's big claims and its militarization of the South China Seas. You also have a situation where the G7 leaders voiced a lot of concern about China's support for Russia in the Ukraine conflict and they also called on China to push for a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine crisis. Another point of criticism on China and a spotlight focus for the G7 nations was the issue of human rights in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. Also, finally, the G7 called on China to avoid actions that undermine democratic institutions and asked them to follow international diplomatic rules. So that was the focus on China, a little bit of focus on, of course, the fact that G7 countries want to improve their relationships with China, but also at the same time, they have serious concerns about what China is doing in the global order today. Now, switching gears to Russia and Ukraine, the G7 called for Russia to end its aggression in Ukraine and pay for damages now totaling almost $486 billion. The G7 countries also announced the extraordinary revenue acceleration loans to give Ukraine $50 billion in loans by the end of the year, funded by frozen Russian assets in Western countries. Now, the G7 also condemned Russia's nuclear threats, which it has made time and again, veiled threats in the context of the Ukraine war. They also criticized their human rights violations and they vowed to come to Ukraine's defense and to support it. They're also going to stick with sanctions on Russia and will also target those who are helping its war efforts, including China. They also emphasized that they want to support the 3.4 million Ukrainians that have been displaced by the war in Ukraine. So this was again another key issue for the G7 countries coming into this summit. That was Russia, that was China, and of course the other big crisis, the other big war is the war between Israel and Hamas. G7 leaders strongly condemned the terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel on October 7th, and they also expressed full support for Israel going out and providing for its security. But they also urged Israel to comply with international law while defending itself, and also called for all parties to protect civilians, especially women and children. The G7 also backed President Biden's deal for a ceasefire in Gaza and for the release of hostages and increased humanitarian aid. And the G7 welcomed Israel's acceptance of the deal, and they also urged Hamas to comply with it. They also emphasized the need for humanitarian access and aid delivery throughout Gaza. In the end, there was also discussion of a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace.